Putin yesterday turned around and said that he had no intention of attacking Europe, but he said if Europe attacked or threatened Russia, then he was ready to give an overwhelming response. Putin hasn't really defined what he meant by an attack on Russia. We've had a Russian aircraft shot down by a NATO country, Turkey, shot down a Russian aircraft that had violated Turkish airspace from within Syria, and nothing happened. So Putin will deliberately leave his understanding of that very vague, because it's all words, it's all threat, it's all setting something in the information domain. I think from a military perspective, from a planning perspective, and from a diplomatic perspective, it would have to be some form of formal attack, Western Air Force or Western ground forces attacking a target inside Russia that would make Vladimir Putin then sit up and suggest that this had been an act of war. But even if something like that happened as a one-off, if there was a Western missile attack against a Russian target because the Russians had done something that we found unacceptable, I think Vladimir Putin would still sit and pontificate a lot before he defined that as an attack or not. So where would Putin strike first, and where are the checkpoints? If it was a conventional attack and he hasn't got the ability to do that, the most vulnerable area is Kaliningrad, and he would potentially stimulate some form of support to Belarusian attack through the Suwalki Gap. However, that would be attacking directly into two NATO countries, and therefore would potentially invoke Article 5. Putin might try other more advanced grey zone attacks, but against military targets operating in the Baltic Sea, in the Atlantic, or somewhere else. So potentially attack a Western warship, or carry out some form of more terrorist-style attack against Western military bases. We've seen Russia carrying out reconnaissance against those bases with drone activity across Northwest Europe. So I don't think Vladimir Putin would be in a position to carry out a conventional military attack. I think we're a long way off, no matter what he says, consideration of a nuclear attack anywhere, but any attack is likely to be in the grey zone. So do I think Europe could hold out without US support against Russia? Everyone turns around and says if the US withdraws from NATO or doesn't cooperate with a NATO plan, then it would collapse and everything else would fall apart. When I was a NATO planner, we had an operation, we had plans for NATO to operate without US support. That is why the Deputy Supreme Commander is always a British officer, because at the time the UK was an integral part of Europe, a member of the EU. But what a British officer does is he brings in that link to the Five Eyes community, will still keep a bridge open to some of the US capability that's there, but also be able to coordinate what goes on in Europe. The Deputy Supreme Commander, that plan still exists within NATO. I'm surprised that NATO hasn't come out and said we have that, but I think they're probably doing that because what they don't want to do is give any little hook that Donald Trump can turn around and say, okay, you're on your own, folks, because US provides a number of capabilities that other NATO countries don't have at the moment and would be very difficult for them to generate. So how many troops and weapons would Putin need to undertake such an operation? That's how long is a piece of string. It all depends on what operation that he's going to do. Putin does not have the conventional combat power at the moment to attack into a NATO country. And therefore, from a conventional attack perspective, we are safe. And what do I mean by conventional attack? I mean an Air Force attack, or a ground forces attack, or a combined Air Force and ground forces attack together to try and capture some territory, because that's what they would use as an objective. How do I know that? Because Russia can't generate that capability to capture the disputed areas of the Donbass in Ukraine. It can't generate that mass to be able to do that. So that leaves Russia in an unconventional attack. How could that happen? It could happen through the use of a rogue missile, use of rogue drones. We've already seen rogue drones going into Poland, but none of them attacked a particular target. We could see that through grey zone attacks that we're seeing at the moment, whether that be cyber, whether that be cutting internet pipes or energy pipelines under the sea, whether that be assassinations, further attacks like the Novichok attack we saw against Sergei Skripal in Salisbury in 2018, or the polonium-210 attack against Alexander Litvinenko, increase in that. but we've seen threats going in against CEOs of defense companies. The CEO of Diehl Defense in Germany has been threatened by the Russians, and the Diehl factory in Berlin was set on fire. We've seen warehouses set on fire in London using organised crime gangs. That's where I see an increase in activity, that sort of grey zone activity that Russia can suggest is plausibly deniable from their state activity, but it's them trying to cause further disruption and to try and create further division across Europe and across international alliances. The signs that we'll see that Putin is ready to strike are simply an increase in activity, an increase in cyber activity, an increase in sabotage type activity, an increase in what's going on in the information domain. And therefore his comment about threatening Europe if Europe attacks is part of him increasing that activity. He's trying to scare people. He's trying to create fractures in alliances, whether that be Europe and the United States, the UK and the United States, UK and Europe, or within different countries within Europe. You're stirring up protests to take political capital away from what's focusing on Russia and have it focusing on other internal issues within either the alliance or within different nations. He's very, very good at that. We're seeing an increase in that activity. And therefore, I think if he was getting to a point where he was talking of attacking Europe, we'd see that increase even further. So does Putin fear NATO, or is he just spouting rhetoric? He's just spouting rhetoric. Yes, he fears NATO enormously. NATO has got a huge, larger combat capability than Russia can generate. Russia's defense budget is a tenth that of NATO, and in fact it's smaller than a tenth that of NATO, and that's without the US being part of it, and therefore he couldn't afford a war with NATO. And NATO's weapon systems are hugely more sophisticated than the Russian weapon systems, and yes, we got our assessment of them wrong before Russia's illegal invasion of Ukraine in February 2022. But what that's done is it's shown us just how poor the Russian command and control is, how poor the weapon systems are, and how poor Russia's ability to prosecute offensive operations is. The West has taken all of those lessons and put it into all the training that we have and the development of any new weapon systems that are coming together. Russia couldn't afford to attack the West. They would lose very, very quickly indeed. So how would Britain get involved in response to a Russian attack? It depends on the nature of the attack. We're seeing Britain getting involved at the moment in the support it's giving to Ukraine, the drive it's putting into the coalition of the willing, and within that read other European nations, read NATO, and of course we provide the deputy commander for NATO. We also command a number of other NATO capabilities. The NATO naval headquarters is based in Northwood, just outside London, and therefore we have a command and control element over that. We are recognised as one of the bigger motivators and coordinating nations across NATO and across the EU. And what the EU loves about us is that we are that bridge into the Five Eyes community. So no matter what happens to US support, we can bring in a link to them from the intelligence capability that they have. And that's something that most other European nations are very jealous of. Capabilities are increasing in France, Germany, the Nordic countries and elsewhere, but they'll never be quite the same as what the US can provide. And that link that the UK has got, that bridge across the Atlantic, is very, very important indeed. So the best thing that the UK has got, in addition to its now limited military capability, is that respect that it's got as a fighting capability, as a bridge to the United States, and as an authority on what's going on. We've got a lot of experience in this. There's no accident that its UK commanders have led NATO in Bosnia, in Kosovo, and elsewhere.